All right, welcome to No Way But North, where we talk about the miracles of recovery and the tools used to achieve them. Not, as always, Big John Meldrum is not with me, but I have probably the better thing, actually. I'm not going to say the next best thing because it's the better thing. Cassie Gardner-Gould, she started as a counselor at Northpoint. Now she does utilization review. So I know we're not going to get into that. She's like, don't talk to me about it because it's boring. But she makes sure that people can stay in treatment. And she makes sure insurance companies let people stay in treatment. And we really couldn't do it without her and her team. So appreciate all the hard work that you do. Cassie is a CADC going to school for your master's in social work, correct? How's that going, by the way? How much time you got left?
You know, it's going.
We won't talk about it?
Got some time left, but it's going.
Okay, fair enough. We'll just jump right into the topic then, because I'm actually really excited to talk about this, because this isn't something that people in recovery communities, or I think even in treatment necessarily, like to talk about. So we're going to be talking about grief and loss, but really about drugs and alcohol. So like grieving the loss of being able to use drugs and alcohol successfully like a normal person, whatever the fuck normal means. But so, you know, you did this last minute. By the way, thank you for agreeing to come on last minute. You've been avoiding it for 2 years, and I finally cornered you.
Totally.
But what made you decide this topic? Kind of talk to me about what it means, what you've seen in your experience doing addiction counseling, and people really going through that loss of being able to like for me, I got clean at 16. So like being the idea I had to accept is like, I'm never going to have that 21 birthday beer with my dad over a football game.
Right.
Right. So talk to me about like what you've seen, what that means to you, stuff like that.
Yeah. So I think that grief and loss, it's probably one of the topics people want to avoid more than anything. Mm-hmm. I think that's true in all different areas. And then I think particularly for people getting sober, it's a really, really tough thing to be facing. I also think it's probably the most human experience we have.
100%.
Like nobody gets through this life without experiencing loss. Mm-hmm. And I think we experience it a lot more often than we think about, because we're usually thinking about grief in regards to death, which is also very prevalent for people in the recovery community. Yeah. But we experience grief and loss every day just by the decisions we make.
Yeah.
So I just think it's very overlooked. And I also think there's a lot of shame around it. Like if you're making this decision to get sober, which is pretty clearly a decision that like is in favor of a better life, right? Mm-hmm. That you should feel good about it and excited about it, and you might not, and that's okay.
Yeah, and that's a weird thing, right? Because it's like, and I'm almost trying to go into a cultural conversation, but I'm not cultured enough to do that. But in America, it's almost expected that you go out and you have a beer.
Totally.
Right? And so like grieving that loss for me was like, I didn't think about the fact that when I got clean at 16, I wasn't going to be able to, like, going on dates is difficult. Finding something to go do that isn't centered around, especially like a first date where it's like, I don't want to lock myself into a 2-hour meal with somebody if I don't like them.
Right.
Right. And so I like that point you bring up about grief and loss being everywhere constantly. And, you know, grief, like, so talk to me about what a daily, like ideally somebody dealing with grief and loss in a healthy way on a daily basis. What does that look like? Because my immediate thought goes to, if I choose a sandwich over soup, right, I'm losing that because of the decision I made, but I'm not necessarily grieving over the soup that I lost. So like, what does that look like on a normal basis when we're talking about dealing with that in a healthy way?
Yeah, I think that, well, a lot of people talk about their experience with grief and saying like, I just don't deal with it. And that's not really true. We're all dealing with things all the time. Yeah. It's just a matter of if you're dealing with it in a way that is healthy or feels good. And I think the first thing is just acknowledging it. Like that, yeah, it is complicated to get sober. And there is a lot that you're letting go of. And it's not just in the recovery community. We see this with, you know, like unhealthy relationships, people who stay in those past their expiration date, and like the push and pull that goes with like letting that go, staying at a job that you've outgrown. I mean, it happens all the time. And there's so much judgment around, like, how can you be sad or angry to let go of something that is obviously killing you?
Yeah.
But you just can. And whether or not you should or shouldn't be is really irrelevant because you still are. So, like, having that judgment about, like, you shouldn't feel that way. You should be grateful to get sober and have an opportunity to live. Totally. And that's fine. And also it's really devastating.
Yeah,
and that's
not mutually exclusive.
Right.
Yeah. How much of that do you think is tied to expectations? So, like, for me, I would love to be able to go home at the end of the day, and maybe expectations isn't the right word, but I would love to be able to go home at the end of the day and smoke some weed or have a beer and relax, right? Like, that would be awesome. Not going to happen for me. I'll eventually start shooting up heroin.
Right.
And I'm grateful to know that. I'm grateful for all the things that recovery has brought into my life. But, like, I think I had an expectation of what my life would look like, right? And I think that's probably, like, when we talk about, like, yeah, sure, you need to be grateful, blah, 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 but it's also okay to be sad and angry and upset that you don't have those things. For me, I'm grieving the expectation or the loss of those expectations not being met.
Right. And it's not, grief isn't always what it looks like. It's much more complex. So it's not about, like, necessarily, I'm so sad I can never drink a beer again. It's everything that drinking and using represented, which, if we're talking about true addiction, it represented everything.
Yeah.
And so it's not like, oh, I'm gonna miss smoking weed, no big deal. You're giving up, like, maybe the only way you ever knew how to socialize. Like, if someone were to ask me to give that up, whatever that would be,
socializing in general,
I just wouldn't do it. You know what I mean? Like, it's crazy what we're asking people to give up, but that people have to in order to save their lives.
Well, and be happy.
Right.
Yeah, we're asking them to give up their entire identity, the entire the self that they have built.
Right.
With the best tools that they had at their disposal sometimes.
Exactly.
Right? Like, sometimes, like, the fact that they're alive is, like, good for you for surviving however you had to for so long, and, like, you built up a lot of defense around your trauma and the things that you went through.
Right.
And asking you to give that up would be fucking terrifying.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't expect this to get this deep this quickly. That's a lot, right? Because I'm just thinking about my own experience, and I don't have, like, don't get me wrong, I don't think anybody gets out of, like, puberty without trauma. But
sure,
like, my trauma isn't over the top like a lot of people's are. And I really struggled with that idea of, like, giving up, not being able to go to a college house party and, like, have those stories, or being able to go home and, like, if I felt like it, smoke weed or have a beer, or, like, have a beer with my dad at a football game. And then you get into people that, have, like, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual trauma, things like that. And that's the way that they survived that was through addiction and coping. And that's the only way they knew how to socialize. That's the only way they knew how to sleep. That's the only way they knew how to literally not blow their brains out.
Totally.
And now it's like, okay, 28, you're going to stop. And you're going to face all of this shit that you went through. And you
need to be happy about it.
Yeah, you can't be upset.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
Like,
no, be grateful, damn it.
Yeah. I want to go back to what you said, though, too, just even with, like, maybe not having a traditional experience of trauma, even something like you're not going to be able to go to those house parties in college. There is something more significant underneath that. It's like, I'm not going to be able to fit in. Yeah. And that is what seems kind of frivolous or surface isn't. That means something. To fit in and to belong is, I don't know, I feel like everything on this planet. So it's not frivolous. And so when we hear people in early recovery talking about being upset or frustrated that they have to let go of a certain friend or not be able to participate in something, and we just kind of minimize it, like, it's just not that big of a deal to give that up considering what you're getting. Yes, it is that big of a deal. And it's just not for anyone else to say if it's a big deal. If it's a big deal to you, then it is.
Yeah. Well, and it's almost impossible to compare too, right? Like, just because you being like the need to be grateful and appreciate sobriety and all the things that come with it is astronomical, and valid, but that doesn't make the grief and loss of those other things any less valid.
Right.
And I think that it's sometimes this weird dichotomy of like, this is such a big thing and so important, and this, like you said, frivolous. That's a great word to describe it. And it's not necessarily as huge, but it's still just as valid. And I don't think that we have a way to like evaluate the value of validity, if that makes sense. That was a lot of V's that I just said.
Totally.
But like we put value on things based on like their size or their grand importance or like the amount of space they take up. And I don't think that, at least in my experience, I don't have a way to like equate the value of like feelings and validity.
Yeah.
And I think that's a whole nother, like that could be a whole nother podcast series, but I think that that's a lot of the challenge, right? Because that's what I want to end with is like, what's the solution? Yeah, sure. Recognize it. Like we can do that, but that doesn't necessarily solve the problem,
Totally.
right? So like we still have to go through dealing with people that are minimizing it, and even healthy people that have great intentions in 12-step meetings or at treatment centers, like they're trying to help.
Well, that's something I want to say real quick is that we're mislabeling it when we see it, right? So
Okay.
like in treatment, let's say, as resistance. You don't want to give up your using friends. You're resistant. You're not ready to change. It's like maybe what we're seeing is just grief, and if we could talk about the grief and like honor that, then you might be able to like process it and let it go. But instead we like put like this negative label on it of it being so, I don't know. I just don't. And I do think some of that is like can be old school 12-step and
sure.
But is it resistance? And two, when did resistance become a bad thing versus just like, well, yeah, you're resistant. Why wouldn't you be? Like just normalizing all of that. In treatment, we look at someone who's talking about their drug use in like a glorifying way. It's like euphoric recall. Sure, it is. And also, isn't euphoric recall happening because we are sad about something we're losing? And so just like, I think on the treatment end, as like a treatment professional, having so much more compassion for that and labeling it as grief, because that's what I think it is. And we have to have compassion for it.
And I think recognizing that too allows a lot more room for compassion. Because I know like when you're working 40, 50, 60 hours a week with clients that are not the easiest to work with,
Totally.
it's really easy to be like, no, just fucking stop talking to your using friends.
Right.
Shut up.
Right.
Like, I don't give a shit. Right. But being able to be like, okay, no, they're going through grief and they're really grieving like this identity in this person that they thought they were gives me or would give me, and I would imagine others, like the opportunity to stop and be like, okay, this is the better way to go about this, to allow space and hold space for this person to resist or grief this loss.
Right.
And hopefully also burnout, right? Like that would, like that kind of what I just talked about, like that would give you a lot more patience and understanding for the people that you're trying to help, that you want to help, that are there for.
And I just think if we take one step back, we can all identify with that.
Yeah.
We've all continued to do something that's harmful to us. You know, we have all been there. Maybe we're all there right now. Who knows? But
this isn't a therapy session.
But like it is. And so because that's a human experience and we've all had that, we also know the pain and suffering that comes from being in that ambivalence, right? Like, I want to make this change and I'm so fearful that I can't. And so I'm saying I want to do one thing, get sober, and I'm doing something else, not getting sober. And of course, like the people around you seeing that are frustrated, and it's irritating and upsetting and scary. But I know for me, like anytime I'm in that ambivalence and I'm doing one thing and saying another, that is the most pain I've ever been in. Once I make the decision, usually things get easier and better, even if they get harder first. But it's the push and pull that's so painful.
Ripping off the Band-Aid usually makes it a lot better. Yeah. Okay, so speaking of like your personal experience, we don't need to get into details, but like how are you able to not only recognize when you're going through that, but also like hold space? Like what are some actual tangible tools that you can use, or that people that are listening could try to use when they're experiencing that?
Yeah.
And at the same time, like continuing to move forward and take the action, right? Because I know me, like in my experience, I would use that as an excuse to just sit in it and not do what I know I need to do about it.
Yeah. It's just so tricky. Yeah. Because I'm like so good at holding space for that sometimes I'm like, how long have I been in this space? I need to get out of this space. I mean, I think one of the most important things for me with experiences of grief and loss in particular is being around people who allow me to talk about it, right? Where it's not something that you're not allowed to talk about, where it's not something that other people are so fearful of that they're not going to ask you, like, hey, do you ever think about drinking and using again? Because people don't want to fucking know the answer, you know? Like, hey, do you ever think about your dead parents? Like, oh fuck yeah, I do, you know? But like people don't want to hear that, so they don't ask. So just being around people who aren't scared of it. I think even though it's not something like I do for myself, we can seek that out.
Yeah, I mean, I would say surrounding yourself with a support system is something to do for yourself. It's maybe not as much in your control as would be ideal, but I mean, support system is something you maintain, right?
Right.
That's not something that just happens.
Right. And I don't know, it's really hard to like provide tangible tools for just sitting in what you're feeling. Yeah. You know what I mean? But that's what it is. It's sitting in what you're feeling. And as far as like, how do you stop yourself from then like spiraling into kind of self-pity and just living there? I think the more practice we get at sitting in it, the less we need to like live there. You know what I mean? When it's not being built up over a long time. If I'm sitting with my grief, let's say it comes up once a day. If I'm sitting with it once a day, I usually don't have to sit with it for that long, you know, versus if it's been built up for years, then I'm usually at risk of like staying stuck in that place.
Yeah, it's like if I'm at work and I just lost somebody and it comes up, like taking 10 minutes to go for a walk at work, I won't need to sit there, like allowing it to happen, it'll pass in the moment. Not forever, but in the moment.
And there's, like when we talk about grief and loss, a lot of people still talk about like the 5 stages of grief. Not that they're irrelevant, they're not, but
that's not the only way it happens.
It's very linear. Yeah. And grief is not that way. I don't like go from being in denial to then being in anger, and then before you know it, I'm in acceptance. Like that's just not realistic. And so really there's this oscillation between sitting with the grief and rebuilding what, you know, your new life. So for a person in recovery, it might be allowing themselves, you know, some space to like feel how they're feeling. And that might mean, I don't know, listening to a song they used to get high to, which a treatment professional would be like, don't do that, it's triggering. Sometimes you need to be triggered, and that's okay too.
As long as you have the support system around you. Yeah.
And then you get your ass to a meeting. Yeah. And that's the restoration.
Maybe do it outside of the meeting in the car.
Yeah. You listen to it in the car, have a good cry, and walk into that meeting, and then you process it. Yeah. But like then do something that's very much infused with the new life you're creating. And just going back and forth between like what you've lost and what you're building is the healthiest way to do that.
I like that. And the one thing that I want to add for specifically addiction and alcohol is I think that a lot of people do this because it's kind of the only way that's accepted in like 12-step communities and recovery communities is like fucked up humor about your addiction. Like being able to connect with other people that have the same shit and like literally talk like you're somebody that's actively using heroin and laugh about it.
Here's what I wonder. I just have to say this because I thought about this when I was driving over here. And about like how healing that can be. And also I wonder if people in recovery were allowed more space to feel sadness and grief, maybe they wouldn't have to make that joke.
Maybe.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it's still healing. Humor can be incredibly healing, but sometimes we rely on that a little heavily.
Oh
too.
yeah, well, and it's a defense mechanism, right?
Right.
Like it's not actually processing anything. Yeah, that's. I wish I knew the answer to that, but that's a whole big maybe that we'll probably never know the answer to.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that got super deep, super quick, which is what I expected from you because you love that stuff. What do you want to leave people with that are listening right now, whether they're in addiction, whether they have family members with addiction, whether they're know nothing about addiction and are dealing with grief in their own way? What do you want to leave us with?
I don't know.
I'm not putting you on the spot.
Yeah, totally. Just like to have compassion for that experience and to speak it shamelessly. Like there is nothing wrong with missing something that was killing you. There just isn't. So own that. And for family members, there's nothing wrong with your loved one missing something that was killing them because it was also at some point saving their life. So just be there for the process.
Couldn't say it better myself. Thanks for finally being here. Was it as bad as you thought it was going to be?
No, it's kind of fun.
I know. All right, guys, that's been No Way But North. We talked about the miracles of recovery and the tools used to achieve them. Alex has our phone number here if you want to leave us a question for our Ask No Way But North episodes. And that, guys, we'll see you next time.
If you or a loved one are struggling with addiction, please call 208-999-4064. The views and opinions expressed in No Way But North do not reflect those of Northpoint Recovery or any other institution or organization.